What is the U.S. government's current policy approach towards Israel, towards the war in Gaza, and is there a difference in that approach and what you believe that approach should be?
Well, Daniel, nice to be with you on the show. And the U.S. position, at some levels, it is. There are some core principles I think the U.S. government has tried to stick with. But if you've listened to what President Biden has been saying, or Secretary of State Blinken, or the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, I do think there has been some shifts over time outside these core principles, and maybe that's based on the reality of what's going on with the second phase of the Israeli campaign into Gaza in response to the attacks on October 7th. But stepping back, I mean, President Biden has said that the U.S. support to Israel is ironclad, steadfast, all the words that he has used, that we have their back, and that Israel has a right to defend itself because of the horrific attacks on October 7th. So that seems to be a core principle. And now there's this debate in Congress about an additional aid package, not only to Israel, but also Ukraine. And it looks like, I'm not keeping up with everything, every move on that, but it looks like that aid package of about $14 billion, I think, is going to go to Israel in addition to the Ukraine portion of it. But also, President Biden has said, and Secretary Blinken and others, that Israel, now that we're a month into the Israeli response, and both the air campaign and now the ground campaign, that Israel has to do as much as it can to prevent civilian casualties as it's conducting its military operations. It also has to allow the flow of humanitarian relief from this one, very narrow point of border crossing in Egypt, the Rafah border crossing that bumps up against the Gaza Strip. And what happens to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are in Gaza who either want to get out or want to know once the fighting starts, what happens to them and who will be responsible for governing. And these are all really, especially that last one, like
Mhm.
these are all really tough questions. So I do think the US position is trying to evolve to meet the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Hmm. When you say, when the fighting begins, I think a lot of people would probably contest that and challenge that, as people have seen with the numerous airstrikes that have taken place thus far, as well as the ground invasion that has begun. But we have also seen other actors kind of state their position on this. Specifically, we're seeing Hezbollah, excuse me, engage Israeli positions. Erdogan state that they will declare Israel as a war criminal to the world. Rather unclear what that will mean or manifest as. Iranian-backed militias are targeting U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, not to mention the tens of thousands of Muslims and Arabs who are protesting their governments to act on what is currently happening in Gaza, as they see it as a war crime. Are we sleepwalking ourselves into a larger conflict by not addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza with a more specific, actionable approach?
Yeah, and I thought I had said already that the fighting is a month in. Not that it clearly, I mean, it has
Mhm,
been brutal fighting for a month on every side. The Israelis are taking losses. The Palestinian civilians are suffering. We don't know
mhm.
how many Hamas fighters have been killed or captured. So, I mean, this war is in full swing, and but it's only a month in. Maybe that's the point I
Yeah,
was,
I might have missed that. Apologies
yeah,
if I did.
trying to make. And no one knows how long this will go on for, what victory looks like for either side. I mean, these are again difficult questions. But to your point about the if you could zoom, for if folks could just zoom out a little bit beyond even this ferocious fighting in Gaza, yeah, things are very tense in the region and potentially other parts of the world because of what people are seeing or hearing about events in Gaza. So Hezbollah for the past few weeks is certainly trying to send a message to Israel that it's there on its northern border, and it is engaged in these small scale attacks, and Israel has responded to those small scale attacks. And Israel and Hezbollah have their own cycle of conflict that they've been locked in. But now this is different because it's part of the war in Gaza. And could Hezbollah escalate at some level, again, based on events in Gaza? If Hamas is getting to the point where they're very, you know, Israel is killing or capturing a significant number of Hamas fighters, and
Hmm.
if Hezbollah perceives that, or Iran perceives that, the relationship between those actors and Hamas is potentially going to be permanently damaged, do they then get involved to save Hamas? Right? With that, we don't know, but that is potential. And likewise, I think over the past week or so, there was some media reporting that within the first couple days of the Israeli response to October 7th, that the Minister of Defense or other security officials in Israel contemplated starting a more aggressive campaign against Hezbollah as well to the north, which had that happened, I mean, this war would look much, much different.
Hmm.
Right now, that has not happened. But again, Hezbollah could spark that, or Israel could initiate that, because it sounds like they had thought about it a month ago. We've seen the media reporting too, as you noted, about these Iranian proxy attacks in Iraq, Syria, Yemen against U.S. troops. Number of troops have been injured is up to a couple dozen. Thankfully, no one's been killed, and the U.S. has responded to those attacks. I think it was last week that there were the strikes against Iranian Revolutionary Guard positions in Syria, but the U.S. also didn't escalate beyond that. And this has been going on as well for the past 3, 4 years separately. First with the Trump administration and into Biden. Iran and the U.S. are, just like Israel and Hezbollah, are locked in their own cycle too. Now it's all part of the war in Gaza, and how things go in this aspect of the conflict. Again, things could escalate very quickly, even if they don't affect the fighting in Gaza. And then the reactions in all the countries you mentioned, in the region and other parts of the world. I mean, this is something that is affecting domestic politics. It's affecting potentially domestic security or stability in countries. And just like what we saw in the Arab Spring going back a decade plus, I mean, what started it then, now that different context, but
Hmm.
what started then, that looked like, these sort of peaceful protests were going to lead to some kind of democratic change in some of these countries, or political change in some of these Arab and Muslim countries, turned out not to be the case. And countries got more authoritarian. ISIS emerged out of the Syrian civil war and the Iraq sort of sectarian political divides that were happening. So I'm not saying that is going to happen now based on this domestic reaction to domestic reactions that are happening in Gaza. But again, it doesn't seem like people are happy. And the more they see these images and pictures of Palestinians who aren't part of Hamas, but just Palestinian civilians getting killed in the crossfire or injured, um, that's going to continue to shape perceptions as well. So the region writ large is very volatile. There's so many different equities and play, and it wouldn't take much. And I keep saying this in a lot of my interviews. It wouldn't take much for us to see something that looks even worse than things look right now. But again, when that
Hmm.
happens, if it happens, who would be involved? Nobody knows. But the conditions, I think, are there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you mentioned, specifically towards the end too. That the conditions, the circumstances are set. The stage is set for something to escalate broader. If Hezbollah engaged Israeli targets and launched an invasion of any, say, capacity, it would not only turn to a two-front war, but three-front as well, since they have positions, Hezbollah, in Syria as well. So that would obviously spread the Israeli military in terms of manpower, rather thin might be a stretch, but would definitely stretch them quite a bit.
Yeah, I
And
mean, Israel hasn't had to fight a multi-front war since 1973,
mhm,
and they've already mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops beyond just the main force of the IDF. So now you've got 100,000 of troops who, at least right now, are mostly focused on Gaza. But if a second front or even a third front opens up, yeah, Israel will face an even tougher time. We also haven't talked about the unrest that's happening in the West Bank, and
Hmm.
there's been a lot of violence that's happened there. And again, the West Bank could be another one of these issues that, like the same things that are happening in Gaza, the same things could theoretically happen in the West Bank too. And even if we're only contained to that, how would Israel manage the fight in Gaza and the West Bank? And again, how would the world react to that?
Exactly. Like specifically the United States, like how much do they get involved? Well, these are was it crew of ships, the word is eluding me, but in stations, on the coast of Israel, would they engage Hezbollah targets as well? That like that aircraft carriers. And that's the thing too. Then how does that bring the United States into this conflict and escalate even more so to where you could possibly see Iran taking a larger step outside of their proxies, such as Hezbollah.
Yeah, these are all excellent points too. And I think President Biden and Secretary of Defense Austin have said that the reason we have put these two carrier strike groups
There we go.
into the region, one off the coast of Israel, the other now looks like it's in the Red Sea, um, must have gone through the Suez Canal or maybe come up another way or gone through another way. But those are positioned to provide the U.S. with a tremendous amount of capability with the aircraft that are on each of the carriers and the weapons that are on the different ships and the platforms. There are probably also a few thousand troops on those ships. I think there's a couple thousand Marines who are in one of those strike groups, and probably other U.S. personnel, because based on what happens on the ground in Israel, other parts of the region, and U.S. interests are affected. Well, then those are the troops that would be the first ones to go in if we needed to evacuate an embassy, or if there were, and hopefully this doesn't happen, but a large terrorist attack against U.S. interest or diplomatic facilities, then those troops would be there to help with the recovery and response to that. There's been some media reporting too that U.S. Special Operations Forces are in Israel right now, more as advisors to help the Israelis figure out what to do on the hostage recovery aspect just in Gaza, because there are still over 200 hostages and about a dozen, or maybe I think it's 10 Americans that are still part of that pool of hostages. So yeah, we have troops in the region. We have tremendous capability in the region with these carrier battle groups, but I think they're there for the most part to deter Hezbollah and Iran from getting involved. And if deterrence doesn't work, then to give us some response capabilities. And a lot of your listeners or viewers probably don't remember this, but this happened in the United States 40 years ago in the aftermath of Israel's incursion into southern Lebanon in 1981, 1982, to deal with then sort of the Palestinian nationalist threat from the PLO and these other Palestinian more secular and nationalist rejectionist groups. Israel went in to attack those groups that were using southern Lebanon as sort of safe harbor and base, but things went badly on the ground there. There were these attacks by these Lebanese Christian militias that killed innocent Palestinians who were in these refugee camps, and the U.S. got involved with other countries to help bring about a ceasefire and provide some kind of humanitarian relief as part of a multinational peacekeeping force. And that's why we had Marines on the ground in Lebanon then. But some of those ships that were also in the same kind of general vicinity where one of the carrier strike groups is now, I think it's the USS Ford,
Hmm.
that's the carrier. They were attacking Lebanese or targets in Lebanon with like battleship launches. I mean, we haven't seen that since World War II. And um, again, is that something that could happen as a result of having the capability in the region, but based on what happens between Iran and Hezbollah, does the U.S. get drawn in? And would it get drawn in like it did in 1982 with that, or once we put the Marines on the ground, they became the targets of these large-scale Hezbollah attacks. And the biggest loss of life in
Hmm.
a terrorist attack prior to 9/11 in the United States was the attack against the Marine barracks in Lebanon by Hezbollah, and over 240 Marines died. So, and then the U.S. Embassy got attacked in Lebanon and Kuwait by Hezbollah as well. And then we have kidnappings of Americans and Westerners, and on and on and on. So we've also seen, from a U.S. perspective now, 40 plus years ago, what that meant for us and how it affected our interests. So, and I also have to think I'd like to think there are people with that same kind of historical perspective giving advice to the White House as just caution. Like, if we're going to get more involved in this, we've seen what it looked like 40 years ago and was not good. And are we willing to accept the same kind of risks again? And these are all things we have to think about from the U.S. perspective.
We've spoke mainly about possible escalation, what that looks like, how will that materialize in the region, and how the U.S. would respond. What are some potential de-escalation methods that you believe could exist out there? Right now we're seeing the biggest, I would say, pain point for these major actors in the region is the civilian casualties are continually piling up in Gaza. Is there, and we're actually just starting to hear from the White House too, that there is the word humanitarian pause being thrown around,
Right.
whatever that looks like. Um, do you think that is like the way forward? Do you think that's something that we should pursue more and actually take, use a carrot and stick approach with Israel for, or and do you think Israel would even be receptive to that whatsoever?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it gets back to, I think, the first part of our discussion where we talked about, what is the US position, or how
Hmm.
has that position been changing? And I think this is where that position has evolved over the past month, whereas um, whether it's humanitarian pause, ceasefire, that some aspect of a pause in the fighting to allow for more civilians to get out, to allow more aid to come in, and to get more hostages recovered too. Would Hamas be more receptive to releasing hostages if they were not under the significant amount of pressure that they are now, both through the airstrikes and the ground campaign that's unfolding as we speak? So, um, that is certainly an aspect to this. But on the flip side, even if the U.S. continues to promote that, and I think the UN General Secretary has also said that that needs to happen, and other aid organizations, that from a domestic Israeli point of view, President Netanyahu said from the beginning, like in the aftermath of October 7th, that the goal for Israel is to crush and destroy Hamas. And I'm sure he's used other phrases, but that's the one
Hmm.
that I remember. And if that is the objective, then how far along are they into their military campaign where they could say, we've done enough to get close to that objectives, and we are now willing to take a pause to let these other things happen to minimize civilian casualties, and again to show that Israel is trying to abide by international humanitarian law and other standards. But he's also facing pressure politically as well. And because of the just the horrific nature of the attacks on October 7th, Israel may not be in that place yet in order to allow the pause to happen, or ceasefire, whatever the right word is. So it's so
Hmm.
complicated because you've got these external forces saying one thing, and then from the Israeli side, you've got a different calculus, both at the political level and I think within the military and the national security side of things, and how that all plays out. nobody also knows. But I do think the more the world sees these images of the civilian casualties, of physical destruction of Gaza, the more that's just going to generate the things we've already talked about, this reaction in the Arab and Muslim worlds, these political protests, and how that all drives towards some kind of um, intervention. Nobody knows, but that just shows how complex things are to even try to get to the pause or the ceasefire
Hmm.
point.
I think it's an insightful point to make mention of the political implications of what's going on right now, specifically in Israel and that domestic populace, because you are correct. Most of them do want the continual campaign, military campaign, to be carried out in Gaza and against Hamas. But I think it's also fair to say that, and there's a great quote on this from an article I was reading not too long ago, but seeking revenge, you can almost lose yourself in like the moral like chaos of things was to the effect of that. And that just speaks to like when you're going after like following the United States after 9/11, September 12th, 2 months later, I think the United States was really rallied around the cause to pursue and hold these terrorists accountable, to hold Al Qaeda accountable for what they carried out, that awful attack. But through those intense emotions, I think a lot of wrong decisions were made on the United States side. That's not that controversial of an opinion 20 years down the line. But we when we carry that out, if there was someone saying, and someone that had influence over the United States saying, hold on a second, like we did this years before, this happened to us. There's a lot of wrong decisions made, a lot of mistakes made, and that resulted in tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands actually of people dying that maybe didn't have to. Should the United States take more of an active role in playing that, even though it may not be politically popular in Israel, the United States does have leverage here. We first mentioned about the aid package that would be, if it passes, goes to Israel, it's $14 billion. And that's not nothing. Should that be used as a point of leverage? Like, we need to figure some things out, such as when you spoke of if there was a pause for people to get out. It's like, get out to where? Like Egypt, Sisi, the leader, he specifically does not want Palestinians to immigrate into Egypt, and Jordan, same thing.
Right.
So to figure out more specifics there, but I mean, my first and direct question would be: should the United States play a more active role and use that 14 billion aid package as leverage to let the dust settle, just so these civilian casualties can stop skyrocketing day over day?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and we don't know how those discussions are happening between the White House and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and but once and what kind of conditions are aligned to the aid that goes forward, so that's a potential. But getting to something you mentioned a couple minutes ago, look, the U.S. made a ton of mistakes after 9/11, and just like Israel, we thought we had to react very quickly, not only in response to what happened, but also to prevent the next wave of Al Qaeda attacks. And I can tell you, I spent my career in government from 2002 to 2018. And those first few years after 9/11, I had a couple different jobs, but I was sort of in the trenches of that world, so to speak. And it was daunting. I mean, despite everything that the US had done in those first couple of years after 9/11, the threat from Al Qaeda was still really high. And even though they basically suffered tremendous losses in Afghanistan after the initial campaign. Um, the Bin Laden and the leadership had to leave, and then we lost the trail on Bin Laden. He went cold, or it went cold. The Taliban basically gave up control of Afghanistan and kind of went underground. So it looked like we were successful early on, but the threat was still high. But then we did things so quickly that we put in place these policy and legal frameworks that allowed things that we thought were going to keep us safe actually wound up having these second, third order effects that were probably, made us I don't want to say less safe, but they just created an additional round of problems. And I teach a class on counterterrorism at the University of Michigan, and it goes through this timeline approach, both pre and post 9/11, to allow students to really look hard at these decisions that we made in these different periods of time. And yes, with the benefit of hindsight, to think critically about, what went well, what didn't go well, and how do you assess like some of the decisions that were made. One that always seems really poignant now, 20 plus years later, is, and this was the first piece of legislation that the US developed after 9/11, called the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force, which was basically the White House's way of getting Congress to agree to allow President Bush to initiate this global campaign against Al Qaeda, and using the military and other parts of our national security apparatus in a way we never did before 9/11. But that bill was passed in a week after 9/11, and it was completely open-ended in the sense of giving any president that authority to go after the groups or people responsible for 9/11 without any sense of geographic boundaries, any notion of duration. Um, and here we are 20 plus years later, and that 2001 authorization to use military force is still in the books, and the Biden administration is using it as well for counterterrorism. And the lone member of Congress, or at least in the House, that voted against it was one person. So in the House of Representatives, I think the floor vote was September 14th, 2001. A single member of Congress voted no. And Barbara Lee from California, and she was attacked politically for being un-American and saying, how dare you not support the overwhelming majority of where Congress or the House of Representatives wants to go. And 20 years later, that single vote of saying, and she didn't say we didn't need, she wasn't saying we don't need to respond. She was just saying we need to think this through and be a little bit more deliberate before we run off to the races and probably start making a bunch of mistakes. And maybe this is a long-winded way of saying that Barbara Lee's principled position on September 14th, 2001, actually turned out to be a pretty prescient insight. And whether those conversations are happening with the White House, even after President Biden left, and he basically kind of said some of those things in his one televised speech while he was in Israel. Whether those same kind of conversations are happening between folks in the White House or folks in U.S. Congress and their counterparts in Israel, we don't know. But we have our own track record of things to consider after 9/11. Some things went well, but some things didn't. And hopefully Israel is taking that advice, if they're getting it, into account as they're conducting the campaign that continues, and again is probably going to continue for quite some period of time.
Appreciate the insight there, and that's a really good call out with Barbara Lee. I didn't know it was that close following the attack on September 11th, but say, as I mentioned, it's more than just advice that the United States can offer or has. As I mentioned, carrot and sticks.
Right. Yeah, and then politically, like again, is the White House willing to use that as a stick? But if they are, and again, like these are all probably very private conversations, then if that gets out, where the Israelis will say, well, yes, the US is willing to give us $14 billion in aid, and maybe that's just the first package, but they're also saying we're only going to give it to you if X, Y, and Z happens, or there are these kind of conditions wrapped around it. Then again, there's a political reaction to that here domestically. So it's hard to know if that is going to be used as a stick, as opposed to just getting the package out now to hopefully allow Israel to achieve its objectives quicker. And if they can do it quicker, hopefully that would thereby minimize and prevent further civilian casualties. But look, regardless of how long this takes, there's going to have to be a day after scenario too. And no one is really talking about that in the sense of, well, whenever Israel thinks that will achieve its military objectives against Hamas. And again, it's hard for us to know that here. What happens to the Gaza Strip? What happens to the hundreds of thousands of people who either have stayed or the ones that are have left but want, temporarily, but want to come back? Who is going to administer the Gaza Strip, and who is going to rebuild it too? I mean, even from what we see now, the significant physical destruction. This looks like it's the same bombed out landscape that looks like what we've seen in other places in the past 20 years. Parts of Iraq and Syria, Iraq first through the first, the war from 2003 to 2011, and then the fights against ISIS from the mid 2010s to the end of the decade. I mean, the same physical condition happened in places like East Mosul and Raqqa, Syria, and other parts of the region. And there's going to have to be significant reconstruction and relief efforts that will have to occur to rebuild the Gaza Strip.
For sure. And I think that's a great segue into the article that you sent over. I read and reviewed. I thought it aptly pointed out the difficulties of urban warfare and drew parallels between what Gaza may look like and what Iraq and Syria looked like. But I am also curious, similar to how, the war in Iraq became viewed as unpopular by the American public, unpopular that is. Do you believe the Israeli public will will that support wane over time as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, it doesn't appear to be. I don't know if there's polling
Mm-hmm.
numbers or any other concrete way to measure that. So all I can, all I know is what I read in the papers. But the political support for the war, or popular support, maybe that's a better way to put it, seems pretty high because of the nature of the attacks on October 7th. But if the fighting continues for a really long period of time, and if the IDF continues to take a pretty high number of casualties, unlike other campaigns they fought against either Hezbollah or Hamas over the past couple decades, does that turn the tide of public opinion in Israel? We also don't know the answer to that. What I do think is striking, and I always hate talking about these numbers because we're talking about human beings and human lives, but the last major Israeli ground operation into the Gaza Strip was in late 2008 into early 2009, about 3 weeks long, and Israel declared a ceasefire after that, and they suffered about over a dozen IDF fatalities and probably a higher number of casualties. Hamas claims they suffered 700 dead fighters and a couple thousand Palestinian civilians. And always the civilian numbers are always higher than the combatant sides, and that's just the nature of these urban fights. But I guess on Tuesday, again, I haven't caught up with every single day's worth of reporting, but on Tuesday alone, the IDF claimed they lost 15 soldiers in one day, which is more than they lost in the last major ground campaign against Hamas going back 15 years. And just like what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, with these terrible casualty figures on both sides of probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of combatants killed or wounded on both sides. How bad will this get for the IDF before the public pressure becomes so significant, where even if the military objectives aren't met, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the senior folks on the IDF are going to have to rethink sustaining the campaign, and no one knows what that will look like
Mm.
either. But I think that will be another factor that will drive the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, from to my knowledge, and this is reported by Breaking Points, independent news outlet, but they were saying that the battle in Mosul that you talked about in your article, that the civilian casualties matched up with the armed insurgent casualties, ISIS, was a 1-to-1 ratio actually. And then so for every fighter that was killed, a civilian that was killed. And then in the war in Ukraine, I believe it's also been cited that around 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have been specifically killed thus far. So the ratios seem to be a bit different. Like, obviously, Gaza is much more densely populated and packed in than Ukraine. But I think this is like the go-to point that we're hearing, especially from certain commentators, is that this is just war, So, and that's true to an extent, but I believe as the Geneva Convention conveys, states that you need to do whatever you can to minimize those civilian casualties, and that's where I believe a lot of people are pushing on that. I don't believe you are doing everything you can to minimize those civilian casualties, and and I'll close with this last thing that we saw a strike in a refugee camp in Gaza, and the international spokesperson for the IDF was, in a pretty tense interview with Wolf Blitzer, and he's like, "You knew women and children were there, right?" And he's like, "Yeah, and we also knew that there was a Hamas battalion commander was there. What's your point? This is war." So I think that is just really going to not. It's not popular. I don't think it's going to stay popular for much, like with anyone, if it ever was. But I think that kind of default line is quickly running out of fuel because it's just
Yeah,
obviously there's a disparity.
and maybe that's why this battle looks different than even the other ones that I mentioned in the article and you mentioned
Hmm.
too, is that because Hamas has sort of buried a significant percentage of its military and terrorist infrastructure deliberately in these civilian locations, they're almost daring Israel to hit them. And uh, Hamas officials have too said some really terrible things where even acknowledging the fact that Palestinian civilians are getting killed or injured in the Gaza Strip, they also have kind of said, well, this is just the cost of our struggle, and they're all now going to be received as martyrs. So there's an equally you know ruthless perception on this from the Hamas side too, and in at least in Mosul and the fights in Fallujah going back to 2004, 2005, before the campaign started, there was a significant attempt to get a lot of civilians out, as many as they could. Now, didn't mean that everybody left, but significant portions of both those populations, and East Mosul was like 10 times bigger than Fallujah, but a lot of the civilians did get out. Maybe that's why the casualty numbers were lower. But because so many Gazans have not been able to get out, and it's such a densely packed environment, and Hamas is deliberately putting parts of its military and terrorist infrastructure in these civilian sites, that Israel will claim, just like, probably like the interview that you referenced, but from the Israeli point of view, it was a legitimate military target. And this is just another tragic reality of the conflict there. Maybe that's why it's different than even the other ones that I tried to describe.
And I think that all plays true. That's interesting. I'm glad you pointed out the fact that there was a time in previous conflicts where there was a opportunity for civilians to leave. But what you just mentioned at the end, that like this is just unfortunate reality of war. I think that excuse is really just going like to fail with the broader as it already has with the regional actors there. They're not going to take that. They're not going to accept that. Iran's not going to accept that. Hezbollah's not going to accept that. If they were to accept anything, Turkey, Erdogan, like, he's like more like populist figure. But that's the concern that I see, because if these civilian casualties continue, but putting aside the humanitarian crisis, if the civilian casualty, and just from a political analyst perspective, if they continue to amount to these extraordinary levels, and that's just the go-to line, then the more outrage is going to continue to grow in that region and almost bode other actors to enter this conflict, because there's such a disparity in what's going on. And the refugee camps, like, it's awful. Like, it's literally just, it's terrible, and it's not good. And that's the concern, because other actors entering this war is like Israel at very real risk, and then that also brings the United States into the war to extent, or most likely would at minimum. But I do want to pivot to something else too, because I know you have extensive experience in a number of areas, and I recently saw an analysis on something. I want to get your thoughts on it and see if you even believe it's true. But the Israeli government used to leverage its intelligence agencies, such as Mossad, to launch these special operations and target specific personnel in the ranks of extremist terrorist organizations. The best example of this I could think of is Black September following the
Right.
1972 Munich Olympic massacres. However, since mainly Prime Minister Netanyahu has entered power in the late 90s, 1996, I believe, the Israeli government has really leveraged its entire military to carry out these broad sweeping strikes. Do you believe that? How do you view this pivot, if you believe it at all? And do you think this is like the right move, or do you think this has kind of created maybe more of a radical, traumatized population of people?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, in the past, the when Israel was using that tactic, the groups that they were fighting were, for the most part, relatively small and clandestine. But over the decades, at least their principal adversaries now, it's not the PLO, it's not the Palestinian Liberation Front or the Palestine, the PLF, and all these nationalist and secular groups that Israel was fighting up until the late 70s into the early 80s. Now with Hamas and Hezbollah, they have tens of thousands of fighters each. If and Hezbollah may have even more. And Hezbollah actually looks more like a military than
Hmm.
a terrorist group, and maybe that's why the IDF has had to scale up its response. Well, we can't just use these surgical strikes against key figures either in the region or elsewhere, because we're facing a very different kind of threat that isn't just trying to put a single suicide bomber or launch a single suicide bomber against us. They can drop, like Hamas did, 3 or 4 thousand rockets in a couple hours, and push in thousands of fighters across our border. That is a very different threat than classic terrorist type operations and activity. And but one would have to think that Israel still has that capability, and will at what point would they try to use it against Hamas officials or leaders who are outside the Gaza Strip? We don't know the answer to that question, but um, that would just be a part of a military campaign that looks like something that Israel did in 67 and 73 against armies, because they're using air strikes, they're using ground operations, they're integrated now in the Gaza Strip. That's a very different response than the one they used decades ago, that were much more surgical, much more um, limited. And I think that's a reflection of just the threats that look different to them.
Understood. Speaking directly to the terrorist attack on October 7th, you recently stated in an article that to execute a strike like this, like how Hamas really coordinated all this and carried out a singular day, they have to at least gone to great lengths to conceal the plotting from Israeli intelligence. However, it's also been widely reported that Hamas was open about the preparations for attack, or maybe public would be a better word. For example, according to Reuters, a source close to Hamas said that they created a mock Israeli settlement in Gaza where, quote, they practiced a military landing and trained to storm it, and unquote there. But they even created videos of the tactics, the article went on to mention. Following that, an Egyptian intelligence official stated that Israel ignored warnings of, quote, something big. So, did this really involve these extremely covert preparations and operations, or was it simply a neglect of the intelligence agencies to have some kind of cohesive communication structure or position in place? Like you point out, following 9/11, the one of the recommendations from the 9/11 Commission was to put together a person. I believe it's the National Intelligence Committee that is connected with all these different intelligence agencies to make sure there's no fragmentation in terms of the information that we're receiving and people left hand is talking to the right hand. So what are have you thought more about that, or have your thoughts changed since that about how this could have been prevented, or how or what Israeli intelligence may have known and
Yeah, I think
neglected to
the
extent?
question, I mean, the story is
Mhm,
still unclear, even though there are sort of fragments coming out about what Israel may have known in the run up to the attack, and it was clear. I mean, this was an intelligence failure. There's no other way to describe it, and the Israelis themselves have admitted that they failed to prevent this, detect it or prevent it from happening. But the actual sequence of events of who knew what when and how much did they know and how was that information being sort of treated and assessed, and how was it flowing all the way up to the prime minister's office or heads of these different services, like we don't know the answer to that, and it took the United States almost 3 years to get a public accounting of that through the 9/11 commission. And I think Israel, whenever this military campaign is done, again, nobody knows when that's going to happen, but they're going to have to answer those questions, and they're going to have some kind of accounting of what didn't work to make sure they don't have another failure like this again, because the implications are just so severe. And it took us 3 years to get that story out through the 9/11 commission. And one of the key recommendations of the 9/11 commission was the creation of the director of national intelligence and the office of the director of national intelligence and some of these bureaucratic structures that came into place. And I served in my time in government in some of them by the late or early 2010. So I saw firsthand sort of the value of having these new positions or organizations in our intelligence community focused on counterterrorism. I think that's a good roadmap for what Israel needs to do, because just like us, they have these world-class intelligence services, but we're probably very stovepiped. And there are also cultural issues that come into that. When you think like you're really good at something and you can do your mission without anybody else's help, and you don't necessarily need to share or pass information, and you want to treat it more as like your services and not like the government's writ large.
mhm.
Um, that can lead to these problems. And these are exactly what happened to the United States pre 9/11. So I would think that eventually Israel is going to have to enact some serious reforms within its intelligence structure to make sure that people are collaborating, they're integrating, and they're sharing information as a matter of practice, not just on an ad hoc basis. And these are all things that it took people in our government years to embrace. And there are still probably some people who think that the things that we did after 9/11 aren't a good idea. And I acknowledge that it's not 100% cohesion on that, but there are always going to be naysayers whenever you make significant policy and strategy changes on national security. You just sort of accept that. So I do think Israel is facing that moment, but I don't think right now they just have the time to put those measures in place because they haven't even achieved, I don't think, their military objectives in this campaign. But probably a couple of years from now, we'll see what these intelligence reforms look like in Israel, and how much of the Hamas planning was out there in the open and how much of it was completely covert and clandestine and beyond the reach of Israel's intelligence capabilities. It's hard to know. But the bottom line is they missed it.
Well, I thank you for all the insights shared. I really do. I'm really appreciative of it. And I think my listeners will too. Just for anyone like listening to this as well, like this really is meant to like give a perspective on how the United States should prosecute or maybe interact moving forward or approach this issue overall and approach this conflict. But I do want to ask you two final quick questions, which is if someone is trying to understand maybe the geopolitical implications here or just what is going on and how to track it, where would you point them to? And secondary, if someone wanted to keep up with you specifically and your media interviews and your commentary and the articles you publish, where could they find that at?
Yeah, good. Well, I'm probably more helpful on the first question than the second one, but on the first question, I get my information from three primary sources on my phone. I don't. unless I'm on TV, it's gonna sound dumb, but I actually don't watch TV unless I'm giving an interview because again, like you can just kind of get drowned out in the noise of cable news and other television. So even though I'm on it a lot, but on my phone, I have three media apps: the Washington Post, New York Times, and BBC. And that's a good cross section of different platforms with different reporters and insights. And those are the things that give me the best insight as to what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And I spend probably half an hour to an hour of my time just reading the content that is on those platforms. And that keeps me, I feel like that keeps me pretty informed in a way that's just um, better than watching television or social media. And I also know a lot of the reporters and producers. And so I have confidence that these are people just trying to get the facts out and the news out versus something that has more of a slant to it. And so I'm always and that's the maybe getting into the second question, that's sort of the role that I try to play in the media. I'm not there to push a personal narrative. I'm not trying to endorse a political view. I'm just there to be an objective uh, analyst, kind of like what I tried to do in my time in government. Doesn't mean I'm going to be right, and doesn't mean that people are going to agree with what I have to say. But I don't try to pick sides. I just try to give a perspective based on my perception of how things are going. That's based on experience as well. Because I wasn't an academic until I started teaching in 2018, so I don't look at this from an academic perspective. But I unfortunately don't have a social media presence, so I don't post the stuff that I do on a social media platform. But just because I cover this range of different platforms that a lot, certainly in moments like this, um, you might see my name in a paper, you might see my face on television, but I don't, beyond whatever, fleeting kind of presence there is that way, I don't bundle everything up and then you couldn't like go to one source to find all that.
Understood. Well, I still thank you for your time. I think there's a lot to take away from this conversation. I look forward to listening back to it in the editing process. But yeah, thank you again for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel.
All right. See you guys.